Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 5th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing, John Hogoboom, and it's been a long time. Welcome back, Joe Bentfield. I'm Brian Rexroad, and today what we'd like to talk about are, actually we have a couple of interesting topics here to discuss. The first one I'd like to introduce is recommended guidance from the what we often refer to as NCCIC, which is the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center. This is a segment of DHS that provides advisories out to the community. In this particular case, this one happens to be a TLP white that is basically one that's intended to go to wide distribution in the community, and it's talking about planning and recommended guidance for destructive malware. So there have been some new developments in the notion of destructive malware, some examples of cases. For example, I think about a year ago, there was a destructive malware event that was that targeted a couple of banks in Korea, and South Korea in particular, that had some effect on their ability to continue business. So what this recommended guidance is all about is making sure that you're prepared for an event of this sort that might take place. So what I thought we would do today is just take a little bit of a look at it, have a little bit of discussion on the topic here, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to take a look at it in a little bit more detail. And even if you don't have access to the document directly, my recommendation is to at least think about how you would prevent or recover from an event like this, a destructive malware event. So first of all, they talk a little bit about potential distribution vectors, things that we might not be thinking about. That is, normally they operate as our friends and could be used against us if we're not careful. And this is referring to things like central management systems, systems that are used for accessing desktop devices, for example, to provide software updates, antivirus updates, other protection measures, and that sort of thing. And those also could be used if a malicious actor were able to get access to those, use those as a distribution vector for putting malware on endpoint systems, or perhaps telling them to run a script or something that might be destructive. Similarly, things like shared storage, whether it be a backup system or network shared storage, those can also be distribution vectors for malware, or at least in some cases even be used for propagating malware to systems through an automated means, more like a virus. Some of the things that they talk about also are best practices for planning and strategies, and that refers to things like how to prevent something like this from having a significant effect. For example, putting in network controls. You wouldn't necessarily want your entire network to be a flat network, although in many cases that may be convenient. You want to have firewalls and things to be able to control how different systems can communicate with each other, to hopefully be able to segment or at least isolate an event if it were to take place. And similarly with access controls, that is to make sure that you have roles and responsibilities and controls around that on systems to prevent the opportunity to have a large effect on broad systems. So for example, you might, if you have a manufacturing facility or something like that, or control systems, you might want to segment that off from the rest of an enterprise so that there are, differences or controls that are to be placed that would be unique to those situations. They encourage monitoring. That is, you want to have some monitoring systems to look for abuses or situations, or at least some accountability, so that hopefully you can detect events, but even if you can't detect events before they happen or as they're happening, you'd at least be able to do some forensics analysis and determine what occurred and be able to lock things down later on. We'll talk about that in just a moment here. And then also looking at distribution controls and, system and application hardening. These are some of the typical things you'd look at in security of systems anyway. Next topic area is recovery and reconstitution and planning. This would be, if one of these malware events were to occur, how would you respond to those events, and then being prepared for that response. So things like, they use the term comprehensive. Comprehensive is a very difficult thing to do, but certainly you want to have inventory of your network network components, systems connected to the network, that sort of thing. Some things that might not be often thought about, internal and external contacts. That is, making sure that you have a contact list for who to contact in a response activity. And that may be much broader than your typical security event if there are a large number of systems affected. And keep in mind that the responders themselves may, in fact, be affected by one of these events. So you want to make sure that you have alternative contact paths in your typical, email might not work, for example. You might need to actually use the telephone in some cases to at least sort of bootstrap your response activities. And not just internally, but externally. You might have contractors, software vendors, contracts associated with those and information. You might need contract numbers to be able to get access to maintenance personnel and in those contracts. So you want to make sure that you have those, and keeping in mind that some of the systems you might have those stored on might not be working too well in these situations. And then make sure that you have restore images, not just a backup of the data itself, but actually be able to re-image systems, and that would not be just the end systems, it would be servers and applications and that sort of thing as well. So make sure you have good business continuity planning, which is important for more, physical disaster recoveries as well. And then last but not least, if a little more ambiguous in this advisory is related to containment, that is working through and planning for working through a forensics process and diagnosing the event and then actually responding to it. And then obviously there are a lot of scenarios that could occur in those. But like I said, I would say this is, I guess, Joe, do you have maybe some thoughts about what may have inspired some of these this advisory, or what might be behind it?
Yeah, I think, we've seen a number of things, and Brian, you had started your discussion of the topic here with, reaching back to the example of the Korean banking impact. There were some media companies involved. Going back a little further, we remember the Shamoon episode, and then more recently we've seen some things around ransomware that gets in and does some destructive things. So, the energy around this topic is becoming, it's increasing certainly. And I think, having some guidance from, an organization that has dealt with a number of these or helped folks is definitely something to think through, because we, universally as an industry, we have some vulnerability to these challenges, and these are the right things to be thinking through and be prepared for.
Yeah, I think this is one where, at least I have to admit, as a somebody who's been practicing security for a long time, this is this is sort of the worst case scenario. It's a situation that we oftentimes don't think about as intuitively as a part of our work activities. The tendency is to assume that, responders have access to communication systems, that their desktop's working fine, and it's very important that we actually think about these kinds of scenarios where we have to be able to deal with these situations. And, ultimately, there are quite a number of points of guidance in this document, but as a practical matter, there's only a certain amount that you're really going to be able to do in the real world to be able to prepare for events like this. But at least going through the thought exercise, perhaps doing some tabletop exercises, doing some, putting some more specific preparations into place. So like I said, having contact lists, a plan in place, and preparations in place to be able to do some things. Won't cost a lot of money, and it may be very important and effective in the end.
Absolutely. The other thing I would offer is, I think, over the years we've all experienced things that were supposed to happen and went wrong, and you can use those breakdown exercises for this exact same kind of thing, right? The unintended consequences of a software update or a botched, patching cycle or whatever, those are similar activities that can have a devastating effect. So, being able to leverage those experiences and the context that were established for that, are exactly right down the line what you're talking about, Brian.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and in addition to just destructive malware, it's good to, think back through these kinds of things. It was just over a year ago that Sandy hit the East Coast, and, took a whole bunch of folks offline that had to think about disaster recovery kinds of things. 25th anniversary of the Morris worm getting loose, and I remember having to actually use the telephone horrors to find out from other people what was going on. Just, some of the things that we don't necessarily always think about until it happens and it's a little late.
Absolutely true. Right.
Yeah, and this is a really good roadmap, I think, for, like Jim was saying, any kind of major security incident. Even though they kind of label it, a destructive malware incident, I think there's tremendous overlap across, any kind of security incident you might have. One thing I wanted to point out that maybe a lot of people don't think about, early on you touched on central management systems there, and we have seen, while, APT actors are not necessarily destructive in nature, we have seen APT actors compromise your antivirus vendors' servers in order to kind of maintain their persistence inside your, company and things like that. So those types of things, specifically with the monitoring aspect, those are the kinds of things we do from a monitoring aspect, as security analysts, looking at who's connecting to what, why are they connecting, are they doing anything odd, in terms of, making sure that, there's no unauthorized access occurring to systems that shouldn't be happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, so good point, John. We typically have not associated APT actors with performing destructive activities. It's certainly the penetration or the attempts that they make to penetrate systems have some similarities associated with it in terms of the distribution factors that might be involved. And there is always that possibility that an APT actor might want to cover their tracks and may use a destructive mechanism in that operation. I haven't seen situations like that occur, but certainly it's one you want to, an eventuality you want to be prepared for. So good points. I guess there's been a lot of talk lately about the CryptoLocker ransomware as well, and I think Joe, I think you were pointing out that Krebs on Security had some discussion about how to protect against that, which is probably along the same sort of theme here, perhaps a little different, a few different perspectives of it. But I don't know. Have you any comments about that?
Well, when you see something in the press, it obviously generates questions coming in, which is appropriate. And so we've, taken a little bit of a look at it from the standpoint of, is there something new going on with this particular issue? There's the, different pieces of information that need to be validated, what's appropriate and what's not. But I think it's generated some good conversation around, how strong of a backup approach do you need to have depending on what kind of malware you're facing. If the destructive payload and with CryptoLocker, it is the, encrypting the files before your very eyes, so to speak. Once that gets started and it's reaching out to perhaps your network attached backup environment, you've got a problem, right? And how are you set up to deal with that? This notion of versioning and offline storage and some of the other challenges there. And then the other piece of it for us, and we've been doing this for a long time in the enterprise environment, where, you have some native tools, and I think we were talking about it earlier, native tools that can be used against you, to spend some time and take a look at that and either leverage them to prevent the tool from being abused or used. So, for example, EFS in the corporate environment, the encrypting file system with Windows, do you have that locked down so that only the appropriate people can use it, as opposed to having some malware come through and use it against you? So those are the kind of things that you can look at there.
Yeah. I think when you sort of pointed out in the CryptoLocker case, this is ransomware that goes and encrypts your files and then basically wants to charge you a ransom to be able to decrypt them. And I think one of the fundamental changes is, in the past, a lot of this ransomware would basically disable your access to files, but didn't necessarily, maybe corrupt the directory structure or something like that, but it wouldn't necessarily actually encrypt the files themselves. And this is one that actually does encrypt the files and uses a public key encryption technology, so the decrypt is not hidden somewhere on your drive. You actually have to go to the the perpetrators in this case, so to speak. And I guess the other aspect of this that is kind of interesting, and I think you were pointing out earlier, is that if your backup is a network-connected drive, it'll go and encrypt your backup as well. So that's you certainly want to be able to be in a position where your backup is protected from this kind of malware. All right, very good. Thanks for the discussion on this. And I guess the next topic that we'd like to discuss here is, I guess, John, nobody is perfect, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely not. Nobody's perfect, and I guess in a sense here, we're jumping on the bandwagon. There's been a lot of press covering the healthcare.gov website, and a lot of criticism. And recently, there's been a couple of security vulnerabilities identified. One wherein a particular user was able to access somebody else's, I forget what it's called, basically their registration notice, that they've been registered with the service and whatnot. And then there was another one, and that had been subsequently fixed pretty quickly. They identified what the problem was there. And then there was another one where, given someone's username for the healthcare.gov website, somebody was able to find out what their password reset questions were. Now, I'm not quite sure. That doesn't sound to me like a security vulnerability because most websites have some sort of forgot password dialogue that they're going to walk you through and ask you questions that are personal to you when you put your username in. So I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily a security vulnerability. But the long and short of it is, every website has some manner of security vulnerability. Maybe not every website, but most do. The only thing different about the healthcare.gov one is that it's gotten a lot of attention. There's a million eyes looking at this website, and maybe you're running a website and you're not quite that big yet, but I guess my thought here is if you're lucky that you're not getting the kind of attention that the healthcare.gov website is, where so many people are gunning for it, so to speak. Right. And hopefully you want to make sure that you've got your ducks in a line and you've done your security assessments on your website to make sure that similar vulnerabilities aren't going to be identified because most have some. It might be really obscure, but in some sense they'll eventually find something on most websites. So.
Yeah, we pointed out, we're going to be talking a little bit more about it later on. Every week in the Internet Weather Report, we're talking about scanning or reconnaissance activities taking place on the Internet. The fact of the matter is every website's getting scanned for vulnerabilities regularly by the threat actors, and they may not be scrutinizing whether it's a high-value site or a low-value site at the time. And they may be, in fact, motivated by particular types of things that they would be going after. So there is no sense of obscurity, in my opinion, when it comes down to having a site on the Internet. Now, as we transition to IPv6, that may change a little bit because scanning, every address in the IPv6 address space is going to be a little bit more difficult. Of course, then there are other ways to find websites, too.
Yeah, I mean, you look at most of the vulnerable websites that are compromised today, a tremendous amount of them, they're done through services like Google. If you know the right query and you know the version of software that they're running, you can find a whole host of sites that are running that version through a creative Google query. There's other things like Shodan, which is kind of another indexing type service of various services running on machines. So there's more than one way to skin the egg, and they can, they'll find the website if they have some indicator of what type of software is running on there.
Yeah, so in any case, I think, as you're pointing out, I think this is basically an example of the state of the software industry, the state of fundamentally there are weaknesses, different types of weaknesses in different sites. Ultimately, there is a need, if you have any site that has password access, you need a way to be able to reset passwords. I was amazed at the statistics that I've seen on the number of password resets that are required to be able to support on a website. It's astounding. It's on the order of about a third of the passwords need to be reset on a regular basis. And so be able to automate those activities with a question and answer response is an absolute necessity to be able to support websites like this. particularly when you have a high volume of users. And, ultimately, I think it points to the fact that you need a threat-oriented security strategy. It's not just enough to put up a site and say that's the security strategy, that it's been checked and scanned. You really need to be able to think about things in terms of, protecting those assets, detecting any abuses of those assets, responding to those, and actually recovering from those activities, and hopefully minimizing the impact that might be associated with those. And incidentally, I think the sort of list of things here that is identifying assets, protecting those, detecting, responding, and recover is actually, kind of integral to the NIST cybersecurity framework that's basically in a preliminary review right now, and is sort of progressing a set of recommendations that are being provided for protecting critical infrastructure. So I think good progress along those lines. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and take a look at some other sort of examples of events that have taken place in the industry here. And I guess, Jim, passwords aren't getting any better, are they?
No. Every time there's one of these major password breaches, we are reminded of what lousy passwords human beings tend to pick. Last month, the big news was the Adobe breach. Information on 38 million users was exposed, and there was a file that was found. It's tarred and gzipped. It was 3.8 gig. It's a total of 10 gig uncompressed. That had usernames, email addresses, the encrypted passwords, and the password hint that users had used on various of Adobe's sites. And I actually had downloaded it myself and was just starting to analyze it. Turns out the passwords on there were kept. They were encrypted with triple DES, which in itself isn't bad. They were not salted, so it was easy to see, that how many users are using the same password, because it was, everybody who had the same password had the same encrypted ciphertext there. Mm-hmm. And I came across a blog post by Graham Cluley, but he pointed to some work done by Jeremy Gosney at Stricture Consulting Group, where he went through and was able to decrypt a number of the passwords, not all of them, assuming he ran it through one of the normal password crackers, but and listed out the top 100 passwords that were being used, and it's the same thing we see every time. The top password that was used on the Adobe site, at least those credentials that were captured, was 123456, and it was used by 1.9 million people.
Now, do you know how many accounts are represented in this sampling?
38 million.
38 million? Okay.
And, the next most popular was 1234567889, and then was password. Yeah. Adobe 123. This was, it's a right, so Adobe 123.
I just did a quick calculation that represents about 5% of the users use that simple 123456 password. Amazing.
So, I don't want to dwell on it before. We've talked about it a number of times in the past, but, some of these passwords that people choose when they're allowed to choose their own, they don't necessarily pick good ones. They pick ones that are easy to remember, easy to type in, but that makes them potentially easy for the bad guys as well.
Right. So I think for the security practitioners here, I think the advice is that try to do at least some basic complex password enforcement on your websites. Otherwise, you run into the potential risk of abuse of the user accounts that are on there. I did another calculation based on the list of the top 100 that you had that were identified. That represents about 15% of the users having basically crummy passwords in use on this particular example. So that's not insignificant. That is, if somebody were able to get a list of the users, or even to get a list of users, I think a site like this that's highly used, 38 million users, you'd certainly have some good opportunity to get access to sites based on just relatively simple password guessing. So complex password enforcement is a relatively important part of basically a good website design.
Yeah, well, there were some other interesting things in looking at this data. Like I said, I grabbed the copy and have only briefly glanced at it. But password hints were included in this. Whether or not that's particularly helpful, whether or not the hint actually has anything to do with the password, that's not necessarily the case. But, some of the hints that are in here are, anniversary, Social Security number. Why would anybody use their Social Security number as their password? But, so if you manage to crack those, have some other more interesting information about these people, and, whether or not that kind of stuff could be used against the users, for some sort of targeted attack against the individual users. There's some interesting stuff in here.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, Jim, I think you've made some good points here. It's important that, not to overemphasize the point, but important that website operators make a good effort to make the password policy not enormously complex. There obviously are there's a need for balance here, but to make at least have some enforcement of complex passwords to encourage the user base to not put themselves in a position of vulnerability. And personally, if I were to make a choice, I would take the questions to be answered, whether they're truthful answers or not, as opposed to the password hints mechanism for trying to recover passwords.
Yeah, related to that last thing though, what information might hackers take from this and use potentially to target some of the users. There was another blog post that I came across from Joshua Dustin, who looked more carefully at those password hints and what kinds of information they might have gotten out of that. One of the things he discovered was hints that suggested that the password might be related to his particular example he came up with was tungsten. Just interesting that from the hints you might get some information about the kinds of things that people are interested in, or just it was interesting. I hadn't really looked, as I said, I only just downloaded it yesterday and hadn't really looked at it too carefully, but all of this information is still out there. If you know where to find it, you can download this 10 gig file yourself and look at it. And the hackers have the ability to do that. And what data do they get when they when they have these breaches, and what kind of use do they make of that? There was an article just yesterday. Brian Krebs was talking about the a breach of a limo company that tends to cater to, and some of the information that they managed to grab there. There's some suggestion that some of that information may have been used for, spear phishing other people. So it's, and that in that particular case, it was the kind of thing, you reserve a limo to pick you up at the airport, take you to a hotel or a meeting or something, and you don't necessarily think that to pay attention to whether the limo company has been breached.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a part of the challenge we face from a security standpoint, right? There are so many web properties, web-enabled businesses now that have taken on the identity opportunity, right? IDs and passwords and authorization. And from a business standpoint, you need to invest at the level you're trying to protect, which is primarily your business, not necessarily thinking about it from, as a consumer, I now have, all these identities for the different business relationships I have. Thinking about the Adobe, kind of makes me wonder how many of those accounts are treated as throwaway, right, by the users themselves. And, is Adobe comfortable with the level of stuff they're doing there? I try and remind family and friends that the accounts that really matter to you need to invest the time and think through how do you want to manage those passwords differently and manage some of the security challenges around that. And then for other things that don't matter, perhaps just making something up spur of the moment and then dealing with a reset in 3 years when you need to do something again is appropriate. But getting this identity thing right is a big challenge across the board, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, and that's good about the throwaway accounts. If there's not a credit card attached to it, then I don't have that big of an issue with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Right.
If it's not a. But unfortunately, in the Adobe case, many of those had credit card numbers attached to them as well. So.
Right. And so that's the challenge. This is not just a challenge for businesses. I know it's sort of a identity and access management is considered one of the business challenges, but it's also a challenge for end users. And I think the idea of having account access that you consider throwaway, but it's important. I think, Jim, as you were alluding to earlier, it's important to make sure you have a good understanding of the information that's associated with each of those accounts and how that, if that were compromised, not just the account itself in that scenario, but if that account were compromised, what information could be gained from that, or how could that be used as to perhaps to target you or your organization? So an example, this limo case, it's not the limo service that maybe was the significant concern. I mean, it may have been for some folks, but the fact that you were expecting notices from the limo service, for example, or from some other site, maybe expecting notices to get software updates, that's a potential spear phishing opportunity for attackers that they might be able to use that against you. And those are the kinds of things that you want to keep in mind in situations like this. How not just directly that account, but how could that account or the knowledge of that account or access to that account be used against you or perhaps to colleagues and friends of yours. Microsoft has some, a new security advisory out. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Jim?
Yeah, and this just came out today. It's a Microsoft security advisory about a vulnerability in the graphics component that could result in remote code execution. Not a whole lot of detail on it yet, but Microsoft says that it is actually being exploited in the wild some targeted fashion. And basically it has to do with the handling of TIFF images, the format used, in fax machines and that kind of thing. Their workaround at the moment, and they have a fix-it available that you can download, but their workaround at the moment is they recommend that you disable the handling of the TIFF formatted graphics images in Office and Microsoft Office and Microsoft Lync, and with this advisory coming out now, I'm not sure when they were notified about it, so I'm not sure if a patch if they have enough time to get the patch in to next week's monthly patch bundle or not. But it is being actively exploited, at least in a targeted fashion in the wild, bringing up to our...
Totally. So luckily, TIFF images aren't ones that are handled very often, so disabling that function is, or at least for most users, I don't think that's one that they use very often. Faxes are somewhat diminished in terms of use. I can't say that I remember the last time I used a TIFF image other than a scanned document. And so hopefully by disabling that, it's not going to be a significant impact to users. And hopefully in the meantime, they'll be able to get the patch out to the mainstream.
Yeah, but this coming out as it is, out of cycle a week before their regular Patch Tuesday suggests that it's widespread enough. Microsoft wanted to get word out, so it's worth taking a look at the advisory and applying the fix-it if you those applications.
All right. Very good. Thank you, Jim. And let's go ahead and take a look at the internet weather of the last week or so here. And I wouldn't say there are any real significant events going on. I think most of the activity we're fairly acquainted with, but a couple of unique things here. First of all, as I think we reported on this even last week, scam probes on port 5038 TCP. This is the asterisk voice over IP management. And this is one where it's difficult to determine what the motivation is in many of these cases. Getting access to voice over IP systems might allow people to be able to facilitate toll fraud activities. That's been one motivation in the past. I suspect in this particular case they're looking for basically a gateway or backdoor into enterprises. In this particular case, what we're seeing is probes we're seeing a variety of different IP addresses that is changing over time, but generally speaking, it looks like most of the probing activity is coming from a single address at a time. So it seems to be migrating around, perhaps using compromised machines for this scanning activity, or they may even be hosted or leased machines that are being used for these purposes. But we've seen a variety of countries involved in this: Korea, Italy, Germany, India, Netherlands, and United States-based machines for doing this activity over time. But as I said, generally it looks like there's one source that seems to be causing most of the activity at any given time. Now, what's interesting is some of the sources, and I just did a little bit of a sampling, but found that some of these sources were also scanning on port 80, 443, and 3389. And that, to me, is a sort of an indicator that perhaps it's not so much necessarily looking for the voice over IP platform, but perhaps, as I suggested earlier, looking for a backdoor into enterprises that they might be able to use for other nefarious purposes. So keep in mind that your PBX or your voice over IP systems might be inadvertent gateways into your enterprise if they're not protected well. Next item here is scam probes on port 135 TCP. 135, as I've looked at the list of basically our inventory. We have a system that we use to associate ports associated with applications and legitimate and nefarious uses in the past. And I think I had about 3 different pages of different worms that have used port 135 for propagation purposes in the past. So this is one that's generally been used for many types of exploits and viruses and network worms in the past. And we're not aware of any significant developments in this area. In fact, I think the use of port 135 is somewhat diminished, or at least a lot of the vulnerabilities have been patched over time. But in this particular case, we're seeing several addresses from a common address block in China. There are 1 or 2 other sources that are doing scanning activity on this port as well. And it looks like, you can see there's a clear trend over the last week or so here, actually over the last month or so, going back to around October 11th, where we saw some increase in activity. I think we reported on some of that activity. Kind of a big jump around October 27th or so, and it seems to have kind of dropped off significantly, but not entirely. That is, as of about the 3rd of November, it seemed to sort of drop down significantly. But again, if you have any Windows-based systems that are exposed to the Internet, or if you have any access of port 135 through your firewall, you're going to want to be paying attention to that, because somebody, for some reason, has found that that's of interest to them. Perhaps looking for systems that aren't well maintained or have been sitting out there for a long time, the low-hanging fruit that might still be hanging. Next one here is scam probes on port 65,500 TCP. I don't know of any specific applications that are using this port. There have been some worms or backdoors and Trojans that have been associated with this port in the past. I'm not quite sure why that particular port was chosen. In any case, nearly all of these probes are from a single address located in China, and it's not particularly aggressive activity, spikes here and there, and sort of a bigger spike up around, we saw a little over about 18,000 probes in a given hour on this particular port, but it was not sustained activity. Taking a look at the most probed ports, and this is specifically for November 4th, Monday, November 4th. And we see, as we've been reporting, port 53 UDP is showing up. This has a lot to do with DNS reflection attacks. That is, the spoof source queries out to a variety of open DNS resolvers in an attempt to get the responses back to a target of a denial of service attack. Looks like scanning activity from the analysis point of view, but generally is not scanning activity. There is certainly scanning looking for those open resolvers, however. On port 445 TCP is still next in line among those. We see port 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database, is a target of probes. Port 80 TCP, looking for web servers that might be exploitable, and then port 3389 TCP, that's the remote desktop protocol. And we had referred to that earlier in the context of the port 5038. Some of the sources that were scanning on port 5038 also scanning for port 3389. Next one here is, again, port 40. This is looking at the most sources that are doing probing. Port 445 at the top of the list, as usual. We also see port 80 on here and port 3389 on here. And as usual, we also see the activity associated with the peer-to-peer activity on the zero-access botnet. That's 16464 UDP, 16470 UDP, 16471, and 16465 UDP. So those are clearly up in the ranks on the activity on this port as well. So with that, that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can contact us through email at threattrack@list.att.com. You can find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel. That's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. You can subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes as well. So we have a plethora of variety of ways to get to the program. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, John, Jim, and Joe. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.